the committee will come to order. We'll commence as a minority of the members of the committee. Present are Councilmember Garcetti and myself, the chairman. And with that, we have one item formally agendized on the agenda. Can I have the CLA read the item into the record?
Sure. Michael Keck, CLA's office. Item number 1, CLA and CAO report relative to establishing an economic development department, the proposed structure for a nonprofit entity, and the status of hiring a consultant to assist in the development of the components and interactions of a new department and/or nonprofit entity.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any public comment cards so far before me. Okay, we'll open up public comment later on after we have the presentations. So first, we'll start off by having the CLA and the CAO and the consultant come forward to present the report.
Well, I think we're going to, yeah. Actually, if we could, Miguel and I will start with a few comments. Most of this is from the consultant. We'll give them room to give their presentation up here.
Excellent.
Again, what you do have before you is the executive summary from our consultants on the establishment of a new economic development framework. This is really the first step in this committee's consideration and the council's review of this issue. You're going to hear that they did an extraordinary amount of outreach and got feedback from a number of different parties. But with this executive summary and the final report that will be delivered on Friday, it's our recommendation that we then proceed to get outreach to various stakeholders to get reactions to the report, and then to come back with you to you in January with an analysis of the feedback, options of establishing the nonprofit, how the remaining functions within the city, where they would be housed and how that would be organized, as well as some final cost information. So this is really intended to be a startup of surfacing the issue and to encourage discussion.
And the only thing I would add is that part of the directive that the CLA and I gave to our consultants was that they look at best practices around the country, and that they have particular knowledge of the economic development structure in New York, which was obviously very helpful, but also look at other entities and how those structures work, what are some of the challenges with them, but ultimately what have been the outcomes. So the report that you'll see today tries to keep that in mind in light of sort of the current situation that we're in. So with that,
Thank you. Consultants?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Eric Rothman. I'm the president of HR&A Advisors, which is the lead consultant for the team. As the CAO and CLA just said, today we're presenting the summary of our draft findings. There will be a full report that we expect to release on Friday, pending additional comments from you. The work that we are presenting today builds on almost 3 months of work we started in late September that we've been working very directly with city staff. It also builds on several decades of experience that the members of the team bring, both in Los Angeles and nationally. Our recommendations, we believe, are robust, but we don't think that we're presenting anything that's very radical. The recommendations are consistent with best practices for how other cities that are competing for jobs and business growth have approached economic development themselves. And they build off of best practices, but are tailored specifically to the situation in the city of Los Angeles. I'll briefly introduce the team and then turn things over to Paul to present our initial findings, and I'll wrap things up with our recommendations for how things should move forward. HR&A is an economic development, real estate, and public policy firm. We were founded in 1976 in Los Angeles. We have extensive experience working with the city of Los Angeles as well as nationally. We happen to be headquartered in New York right now. And we've created new economic development models for many other cities, including one of our partners is the founding president of the New York City Economic Development Corporation and was integrally involved but was not able to be here today. That's Carl Weisbrod. We helped to create the Cincinnati 3CDC, which is the Center City Cincinnati Development Corporation, the Anacostia Waterfront Corporation in Washington, D.C. I was director of business planning at Transport for London when we were helping to create that new organization in London. We also worked on the London Olympics Legacy Corporation as well as many other cities. We were joined in this effort by ICF International, which is a large international consulting firm with experience with economic development as well as other governmental functions. They led the organizational inventory and analysis, which was quite extensive in terms of documenting all the city's current economic development functions. And by Renata Simrel, who served as a senior advisor to the team. With that, I'll turn things over to Paul to talk through some of our findings.
Thank you, Eric, and good afternoon, council members. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. What brings us before you today is the results of a response to the direction that you and your colleagues on the City Council gave to the CAO and CLA back in June to analyze a variety of issues having to do with how the city has previously and might in the future structure itself to do a better job of delivering economic development services in the city of Los Angeles. You directed the CAO and CLA to explore establishing a new economic development department specifically. You endorsed in concept the idea of an allied nonprofit entity based on the initial research work that the CAO and CLA did on that issue. You asked that the CAO and CLA evaluate city economic development activities as they currently exist and to provide some feedback about how improvements could be made. And as Mr. Santana indicated a few moments ago, you very specifically asked that there be an evaluation of how other leading cities in the United States organize themselves to do a good job of delivering economic development services in their jurisdictions. And of course, you then created the ad hoc committee in order to follow through on the work that we and the CLA and the CAO have done together. This is not, of course, the first time that the City Council has addressed this issue. In fact, the City Council has been looking at this issue with fits and starts, so to speak, for the last 20 years. The first effort that we know about came about back in 1992 when there was the initial direction by the Council to explore the issue of forming an economic development department. After the civil disturbances in 1992, there was an effort which we actually helped with to work with the Housing Department, the former Community Redevelopment Agency of the City of Los Angeles, the CDD, Community Development Department, and the Housing Department to think about, at that point, how to better organize the city for delivering economic development services. And at that time, recommendations were put forward about strengthening the role of the redevelopment agency because although economic development was not its core responsibility, of course, they were, at least in the collective view of the four departments and us at the time, probably in the best position to begin to focus on that issue in a more concentrated way. Then a few years later, when you considered adopting the framework element of the general plan, you adopted a set of goals, objectives, and policies for a new economic development element of the general plan. And the included in what you adopted is a policy calling for a reorganization of the city's economic development infrastructure. A few years later, as the economy began to experience other difficulties, and as the council continued to debate the debate that started in 1992 and discussion about how to revise the city's economic development infrastructure, particularly involving issues about whether or not to assume a different form of control over the redevelopment agency and perhaps how to integrate redevelopment agency staff into the city structure. The council empowered the formation of a task force to look at these issues, and they provided you some further guidance, most of which, again, focused on some issues related specifically to the redevelopment agency. And, of course, more recently, after giving your direction in June, you have formed your current committee. Over the last 10 weeks, we've been involved in a very intensive research and analysis project in order to respond to the direction that you gave to the CAO and CLA. We've conducted a series of over 80 interviews with a variety of stakeholders inside and outside of city government. This has included a variety of leading private sector business leaders in Los Angeles in a wide range of fields, chambers of commerce in the San Fernando Valley and citywide, and a wide range of individuals inside City Hall at the general manager level and below, and also with several of what we call your economic development partners, such as Metro, the Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation, and others outside of City Hall, but who work with you to one degree or another in trying to advance the city's economic interests. We also mounted an online survey so that we could try to reach out to other groups that we simply didn't have time to interview in person. These included a wide range of community-based nonprofit organizations that are involved in economic development in one way or another. We also conducted, with ICF's help in particular, very detailed interviews with general managers and their senior staff in a variety of city departments that either have some direct or indirect relationship to economic development operations in the city, in order to try to tease out exactly how much time, effort, and staffing is devoted to this subject, because, as you know, there are probably only maybe 2 departments in the city that specifically identify economic development as a function. There is a unit within the Community Development Department, and there is a unit within the Department of Water and Power. Otherwise, economic development activities, as generally defined, do occur in many other departments and are supported by many other departments, including the permit issuing functions of the Planning Department and the Department of Building and Safety. But most of them do not specifically call out, nor is there a line item in their budget specifically for economic development. So we spent a fair amount of time trying to tease out the existing governmental structure related to this concept, to document the number of staff and dollars that are associated with it to the extent that we can. And I think we were reasonably successful in trying to do that. And when you see our full report, you will see in the appendices to the report a fairly detailed presentation of that analysis, which is summarized in the body of the report. And again, in response to your direction and the direction that we received from the CAO and CLA, we conducted 8 very detailed case studies of what are generally regarded to be the best-in-class economic development operations in other major cities in the United States. And that included Austin, Texas, Boston, Chicago, Cincinnati, New York City, Philadelphia, San Diego, and San Francisco. And again, when you have an opportunity to see our detailed report, you will find quite a bit of information about how those cities operate their economic development operations. And we have tried to draw important lessons from that work to offer guidance that is applicable to the city of Los Angeles. And I want to hasten to add that we understand that Los Angeles is not like any other city. There are fundamental differences both in political organization and economic relationships and relationships between the public and private sector. And so our recommendations are not simply grafting ideas from other places onto Los Angeles, but trying to tease out of our research the best information that we can draw in order to provide informed recommendations for your consideration. Now, cities, of course, don't control their economies, as you know from painful experience of watching the gyrations of the national and global economy and what they've done to Los Angeles over the terms that you've been in office and before. And so it is not possible for those of you sitting on the dais in City Hall to really change the course of the city's economy much as you might like to. But what the city can do is to take concrete actions to better ensure that the city's economy is positioned well to mitigate adverse impacts on the city's economy resulting from external forces in the national and global economy, and to capitalize on opportunities. These actions that you can take include policies, regulations, investments, and services that support and guide business growth. If done well and strategically, the city's efforts will help expand business activity and sales, creating more jobs and more quality jobs, both at the skill level and pay scale, which leads in turn to higher worker and household earnings and additional consumption spending within the city's economy. This in turn fuels expansion of the tax base, enabling the city to expand services to residents, businesses, and visitors, and we call this the virtual cycle of economic development. The services that the city can provide and the policies that it can adopt and the direction that it can provide to help guide the local economy in our view, fall into these three basic categories shown on this slide. Strategic planning, giving overall direction based on very careful and thorough research about where the economy of the city is currently and where it might be headed based on the best available information. Real estate and development services, including asset management and transaction services. Two issues that unfortunately at the moment are in limbo because of the demise of the redevelopment agency. And business and industry and other forms of development services delivered specifically to industry sectors that you may wish to support for the future, and small business development, workforce development, the network of business improvement districts that have become increasingly important in delivering services to neighborhoods around the city, and of course tourism development. In the work that we do around the country, and based on the best practices case studies that we conducted, we identified 5 specific characteristics of what one might think of as high-performing municipal economic development operations around the country. These are economic fundamentals, that is the ability of the local economy to be regionally and internationally competitive because of its scale, its industry composition, and the various forms of infrastructure and utilities that it has. Secondly, leadership, particularly from its chief executive. Resources for economic development that have to be commensurate with the mission of improving the economy, growing the tax base. Flexibility of the economic development organization in order to respond to changing circumstances and be nimble and adaptable. And finally, a core of human talent working on economic development that is highly skilled, entrepreneurial, and incentivized to succeed. These are the 5 characteristics that we've distilled from our research and analysis, which should be present for a well-functioning economic development organization and set of services in a major city in the United States. And what we suggest to you should be the objective that you try to achieve in thinking about how to deliver economic development services in the city of Los Angeles. As we compare the city's current operation in the economic development sphere against those characteristics, we find that the city obviously has very strong fundamentals. You have highly developed and dominant export-oriented industry sectors, including but not limited to the entertainment industry and in diversified manufacturing. You have obviously very strong utility and infrastructure systems, available land supply to support growth, a world-class set of higher educational institutions, and a large and skilled labor force. So in terms of the basic economic fundamentals, the city is in excellent position, and ideally you would want to stay there and improve your position. But without excellent economic fundamentals, the rest of this doesn't matter. So fortunately, the city is very strong in this area. We do, however, find a series of weaknesses in our analysis based on our review of the operation of existing departments and our conversations with well-informed observers of the way the city operates. We found limitations on leadership in the economic development sphere. The concerns have been that the council and the mayor tend to focus on this issue from time to time, particularly when the economy is in difficulty. But once the economy starts to improve, everybody gets busy with other issues, and there's been a lack of sustained attention to this issue among the city's leadership, both in the public sector and in the private sector. This is not unique just to City Hall, but we think the same sort of episodic attention to this issue is present in the private sector as well. We found from our analysis that the resources, particularly financial resources to support economic development initiatives in the city, though it has a number of useful funding sources that can be used to assist business and to support new development, but that it is these resources are not at a scale that is necessary to support what the city needs to do. And with the demise of tax increment financing, with the dissolution of the redevelopment agency, the existing set of resources is even more diminished now than it was previously. We also find from our research and analysis that the organizational flexibility within the city to focus on economic development comes up short, and that the human resources devoted to this subject also are insufficient to the task, again, made more difficult by the demise of the redevelopment agency and the loss of some of the very talented staff who used to work in that organization. What we want to turn to next, and Eric will now describe it for you, is how we recommend that the city think about restructuring itself to address these shortcomings that we identified and to move more in the direction of best practices of high-performing cities across the United States.
Thanks, Paul. The organizational chart that's shown here is consistent with one that's in the executive summary and will be in the final report. And we just want to draw everyone's attention to the blue boxes, which is what's proposed to be new. First, an economic development department, which would be a city department that would be a largely service-oriented department, and that would contract with a new citywide economic development nonprofit, which would be an independent transaction-oriented nonprofit. And I'll speak in more detail about both of those in the next few minutes. We also recommend a different role for a deputy mayor of economic development that would really provide policy oversight for the economic development department, which I will probably call EDD for the next several minutes, as well as with the nonprofit. And in addition to that, would coordinate with the other city departments that are performing economic development related services, which include city planning, building and safety, transportation, recreation and parks, cultural affairs, and the convention center, as well as with the proprietary agencies of LA World Airports, the Port, and the Department of Water and Power, and economic development partners such as the Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation. The Economic Development Department, or EDD, would provide services that support the city's businesses, key industries, and communities. This would include small business services, workforce development, the business improvement district oversight functions, as well as industry-specific service desks that focus on providing services to grow the city's major industries and targeted industries. It would oversee the new citywide economic development nonprofit, and it would do that through a contract between that nonprofit and the EDD. This is consistent with the model that's used in other cities, including New York City. It would prepare a citywide economic development strategy. Something interesting is that what came up again and again in both the stakeholder interviews and in the survey was a real thirst for having a citywide economic development strategy, which HRNA thinks is important for cities, but shouldn't. We don't think that the city should wait to do. It shouldn't wait to do everything before it has such a strategy in place. But it's important to have that strategy in place and bought into to set policy direction. To make sure that the city is aligned behind what industries it seeks to attract, what assets it has to offer, and what tools it has in order to affect that economic development. And lastly, would serve as a clearinghouse for the city's distribution and management of various federal and state resources for economic development. This includes significant federal funding, for example, for workforce development. The new nonprofit. The recommended organizational characteristics for this nonprofit are really based on best practices and the types of nonprofit economic development partners that are in place around the country. We recommend that this be an independent 501c3 nonprofit that really serves as a partner to the city on citywide economic development, but remains independent. It should have a majority private sector board of directors, and that board should be comprised of leaders and experts in fields of business, real estate, finance, law, community partners, labor, and higher education. Its overall character should really be transactional, results-oriented, and flexible as an agent for the city in implementing the city's policy. It needs to be self-governed, but yet accountable to the city, and that's the purpose of the contract. It would be accountable to the electorate through this contract with EDD that would be approved by the council. And it should have highly skilled entrepreneurial and professional staff that's incentivized to succeed. The nonprofit, as I mentioned, would be transaction-oriented. We envision it as managing the city's strategic real estate assets, managing the various off-budget finance entities. So currently, the Los Angeles Development Fund and IDA are elsewhere. We recommend that from a management perspective, from a management and staff perspective, that they become affiliates or a subsidiary of this new nonprofit, but retain their independent boards. It should advance major economic development and public-private real estate projects, provide expert analysis, and negotiate transactions that can then be provided, that can be incubated within the nonprofit and presented to the EDD and to the mayor and council for approval, and should conduct city-specific economic research and analysis. It would need to partner with the Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation, which also does research for the county, but the city needs its own research and analysis function, and we imagine that this would work very closely with the strategic planning group that we're recommending in the new EDD as well. In terms of our estimated and recommended budget for these organizations, we've estimated a year one budget, which we envision to be fiscal 2013 to 14. The organizational structure would be one where the general manager would report to the deputy mayor. It would oversee the citywide nonprofit. We also think that it makes sense for the Film LA contract, which is currently managed by the CAO, to also be managed by this new general manager, and would have operating divisions for business and industry services, small business services, workforce development, and business improvement districts. We've estimated we've looked very carefully at the current city resources, which are primarily within CDD and the Office of the City Clerk, that are carrying out the functions that we recommend for this new EDD. Our report identifies that if you were to transfer the resources that are currently carrying out those functions, the budget associated with them is about $27.5 million. And that constitutes approximately 135 to 140 FTEs that we would recommend transferring from other city departments into this new EDD in order to create the new EDD. For the nonprofit, which would need to be formed by private individuals, we've also suggested a structure for it based on best practice and our findings specific to Los Angeles. There would be a board of directors which holds a contract with the Economic Development Department. They would appoint a president or chief executive officer, and would have operating divisions associated with strategic planning, business and industry development, so marketing and attraction retention, asset management, public-private real estate development, and transaction services. We estimate that its initial year budget would require a contribution from the city of approximately $5 million for startup operations and initial project funding. While it's not ultimately our, it's not certainly not our decision, but and it's really up to the city as to what level of funding and where it comes from. But potential sources of funding could include funding that's already been identified by the mayor and city council for establishing such a nonprofit, from the General Services Department Asset Management Division. There's surplus property tax revenue, additional surplus property tax revenue coming from the former CRALA. The Department of Water and Power has an economic development group which could provide a grant. The Austin economic development structure is actually almost entirely funded through its city-owned utility. And over time, and potentially in the first year, could generate transaction fees from real estate services. We recommend city funding, as I said, of approximately $5 million, but anticipate that if this organization succeeds as its peers have across the country, within approximately 5 years, the nonprofit should be able to become financially self-sufficient through earned income from transaction fees and the like. And to give an example, when New York City's Economic Development Corporation was founded back in the early 1990s, it initially had city funding of approximately $7 million a year. It had a large real estate portfolio from which it earned income as well, but had city funding of $7 million a year. In recent years, it's returned about $100 million a year to the city treasury through its operating earned income. If the council agrees with these recommendations, our recommended steps for implementation associated with the EDD would be first to finalize these recommendations through consultation and revision as appropriate with stakeholders, the council and others in city government. There would need to be a draft ordinance in order to establish the EDD. The budget, which we've done, we've prepared an estimate, would need to be vetted, refined, and proposed as part of the city budget process. We recommend conducting an executive search and appointing a new EDD general manager who would be a very significant national economic development figure. The budget would have to be approved prior to the start of the fiscal year. We've recommended that the mayor form an economic development cabinet in order to coordinate all economic development activities under the new deputy mayor. That would be the economic development activities of the new entities in formation, as well as those that are currently existing within city departments and proprietary agencies. There would, by late spring, we hope that the nonprofit is set up and that a service contract could be negotiated, and operations would begin in July. For the nonprofit itself, this would have to be driven largely from the private sector. We envision private sector representatives with some form of nudge from the city, forming the nonprofit or agreeing to form the nonprofit and identifying potential board chair candidates. To become an entity, it would need to file articles of incorporations and applications for tax exemption, as well as various other certifications. It would have to select the remaining board members, appoint a chair, refine its first-year budget request from the city, negotiate the service contract with EDD for mayor and council approval, and once it knows what it's going to be, to recruit a president and initial staff. So in conclusion, the full findings will be detailed in the report that we expect to be released later this week, but our recommended structure includes the new Economic Development Department, the citywide economic development nonprofit, and a changed role for a future deputy mayor for economic development. These recommendations are based and built upon national best practices, but tailored to the city of Los Angeles. We believe that they invest existing city resources for initial operations and that there's long-term potential, particularly for the nonprofit, to become financially self-sufficient. And ultimately, the reason this is all being done is to position the city for future business growth, job creation, and expansion of a local tax base that will capitalize on the strong fundamentals and future leadership for economic development of the city. So thank you very much for your time, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your report. So with that, do you have any questions for CAO, CLA, or the?
You want to jump on first?
Go ahead, please.
All right, thank you very much for the report. I know we're going to be moving things along, and this is an excellent start. Thank you for the work that you did. This is something that I've worked on before I even came here as a council member. When I was teaching at Occidental, there was a group that came together to look at economic development, consolidation of departments that I was a part of years ago. So it's kind of a dream come true, but we also, I think, have a long way to go. It wasn't in the scope of what we asked you to do, so this isn't a criticism of the report, which I think is very good. But for me, this discussion starts and has to have the context of exactly where we want to go and who we are, and the analysis of the economy itself here. An economy which 40 years ago was basically in line with the Bay Area and per capita income and has declined 30%. A city that's lost 165,000 jobs in 30 years. A region that has stopped acting like a region, that has less strong elite institutions than other parts of the country for helping foster a business. And so part of the things that I read were what's missing, not because of, again, it wasn't what we asked of you, but you've recommended, you've looked at a lot of cars around the country. You've found the elements of what makes a good engine and a good for shock absorbers and other things that are common, but we really never identified where we want to go, where we want to drive, and what terrain we're covering. And so for that, part of it is we can have a really good abstract intellectual discussion about, what makes a good economic development entity. But LA is such a strange place and such a unique place and such a beautiful place, but it requires, I think, sometimes there's no place we can really look to for the exact copies. Some of the things, for instance, that are not in here that are so critical to growing an economy, the marketing of a region, thinking about regional, thinking across cities, and how LA can be a spur to help other cities. I mean, Caltech's right next door. It doesn't happen to be in our city. We need to be working with Caltech, just as we do with UCLA and USC. Looking at the role that transit plays in development, and as a key driver right now, as we see even the Expo line connect through USC, information technology companies that are in Culver City and downtown, and soon linking with the other hub of Silicon Beach and Venice and Santa Monica. Troubleshooting, which is, one of the biggest things we do. I think lots of times we take analysis of economic development and we call it economic development for political reasons when it's basic government services, which is different than economic development, which is much more strategic. Making sure it's easier to get your business open is important, but it's also just as important for business to have a paved street and a good school. Those are basic government services that we have to look at in the context of this, but I'm interested in putting our dollars, as limited they are, in real things that will be an investment in truly promoting economic development. The retention of our workforce, that 75% of our engineers that are trained at these excellent universities leave here, that not enough ideas go from the classroom to the boardroom for whatever reasons, unlike up in the Bay Area and other places. So kind of that ecosystem promotion and what this city can do to help foster that. I was on the phone yesterday with a bunch of folks who are working with the mayor's office and some others on really capturing those digital information companies that are part of Silicon Beach here. They said, what can we do to physically make City Hall a place that we gather? Because when we do, it's like what Mayor Bloomberg did by taking a city that never had technology and telling that story and convening, and through the power of convening and a couple partnerships, he made New York a player in digital information companies where it wasn't before. Here in LA, we've always had that. And I already mentioned some of the things with elite associations. So I think our emphasis in stepping back and making sure we know what problem are we trying to solve here instead of just the consolidation, because we've all been excited to have the internal piece. Those of us who live our lives inside this building always get frustrated with the frustrations of why do I have to go to 5 different departments? Companies need things across the board. But if we think of ourselves outside this building for a second and outside government, we've got our work cut out for us to make LA a vibrant economic hub again. And I want to see this economic development entity be a real catalyst for that. And so I think, this is going to be a healthy step moving things forward, but I want to make sure we ground the conversation in those concrete steps, because you can have a nice car and suddenly we find ourselves, we're supposed to be off-road and we have a Maserati, and that doesn't really help. Or we're needing to have some passengers in the car that are simply not there. And that wasn't, that we've had a slow decline over 40 years. It's not going to reverse itself in 1 or 2 years. But I do think we need to have a story of where we want to go economically and who we are. And that's the piece that I think we need to insert to the conversation as we move forward. But, in terms of the what we have here in the specifics, it's a good start. I want to, look at the difference between the Economic Development Corporation and whatever the department is, because I can see a lot of bureaucratic chaos that could ensue if we don't do that in the right way and be very clear. And looking at other cities, they do sometimes coexist, but sometimes, there's one that's the lead in terms of serving businesses that come and have problems to solve, and the other one is the lead in terms of really expanding the sort of programs and the ecosystem for making industries come here, grow here, stay here, et cetera.
Thank you, Eric. I want to also formally open it up for public comment. We still do not have any public comment cards that have been forwarded to the front here. Is anybody here for public comment on this item? Anybody here from the public to comment on this item? Seeing none, public comment is now closed. With that, to also add to what you mentioned, Eric, about the potential for particular industries and particular activities within our city and our region, I think it's important that going forward, if there's any way that it could be, we could see some analysis on what we seem to be attracting and what's growing in our region and in our city, but also at the same time being honest with ourselves on the kinds of things that may be hard and fast limitations to certain industries and certain growth sectors that perhaps we're just not a good candidate for. We all like to assume that being beautiful Southern California and an economic engine in and of itself that rivals economics of entire countries. Let's be honest with ourselves. What is there something out there, or there are certain elements or certain industry trends that just don't lend themselves well to our community here. I would find that hard to believe that we have major limitations, but if we do, we should know those going in. That way we don't, like you mentioned, Eric, we don't go down a road and then realize that we're going down the wrong road and that it's something that we really can't recover from. And then we'll find ourselves utilizing energy and expectations that perhaps we could have used that same amount of energy and got better results. So with that, what I'd like to do is make some recommendations. First recommendation is that we instruct HR&A, who are the advisors here, to circulate the final report and conduct outreach to stakeholders for input on the new model and report within 30 days with the results of the outreach. Is 30 days enough? I know we're coming into the holidays. Perhaps we can make it 60 days?
Thank you, Mr. Cardenas. We would appreciate a little more flexibility.
Okay. All right. So 60 days?
Flexibility means time.
Yes, exactly. And I don't want to be rude, but I'm not going to be here 30 or 60 days from now.
Congratulations on that.
If whatever works for my colleagues.
But this is all going to be
and you.
funded by the Congress, right?
I was just going to
You know
say,
what I'm
I know what my role is going to be. My role is going to be just try to figure out what kind of grants and resources we can get from the federal side. So that's the first instruction. Also, this committee will instruct the CLA and CAO to report on the following, which is 1, costs related to the implementation of the new economic development delivery model, 2, the next steps to achieve implementation, and then 3, options for creating the not-for-profit. Obviously, creating a not-for-profit of this magnitude and with the longevity that we would expect, we need to make sure that the model is something that fits us, and certainly a model that, fortunately, we do have some examples with big cities around the country. We need to make sure that we have the best practices in mind and what fits us the best. Okay? Anything else?
No, I think I'm good with that.
Okay. So those will be the instructions from this committee, and this committee will convene, I would assume, in and around the time that the report comes back to us from the outreach and the additional information as we've just requested from the CLA and the CAO. Okay. What's that? Okay. Again, we open it up for public comment. There's only one item on the agenda, and we've covered that item. Those are the instructions so far. In addition to that, we've been operating as a minority committee as well. And any other specifics? Okay. With that? Yes.
No. So we're all set.
Okay. Okay. With that, general public comment. Do we need to open up for general? Yeah, okay.
I think we
Well, is there anybody here for general public comment that items that are not on the agenda? Okay, and seeing and hearing no one come forward, general public comment is now closed. So with that, this committee is now adjourned.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Thank you.